David, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
David, you are a former professor who has a PhD in psychology and three masters. You're
Right.
also an, an author of several books on leadership and innovation. In your experience, what are some of the common challenges leaders face in creating a joyful and thriving work environment?
The challenge of creating a joyful and thriving environment are perhaps two separate things. There are many leaders who could create a thriving environment without joy, and you can get those that perhaps create joy, but the environment's not thriving. Obviously, we need both. We need the organizations to be able to achieve meaningful outcomes and at the same time fulfill the potential of the individuals to have a meaningful experience, which will contribute to sustainability of all this kind of work. I found more recently that the dominant theme that a leader really needs to focus on is the psychological safety of the teams that they work with. And the more that they are able to create an environment where the team members feel that they are enabled to speak up and share their thoughts and be open allows them to feel empowered and feel part of the process. And the leaders that can do that usually have greater emotional intelligence, usually have the ability to create something with a collective that allows for that trust and that openness and honesty, which brings us a level of contentment and empowerment to the rest of the group, which is a foundational piece to joy.
I fully agree with what you have shared. And I was wondering if for our listeners that are leaders and want to dive deeper into the topic of psychological safety, what would be three practical tips that you can offer them that they can begin implementing to create that psychological safety? Where do they begin?
Well, first, let's understand what psychological safety is. Most of the time, when it's described in a way that it is reflecting a concept of how you could create an environment where people don't feel like they'll be punished, where they'll be reprimanded if in fact they speak up. There was this very interesting research by Google about maybe even 7 years ago, where they compared teams that had a great mix of people, and yet one team was very successful and achieved meaningful results, and they were very motivated, while the other team also had the right people on it, but they were not performing well. And in their research, they found a number of things, but the number one variable was the extent of psychological safety. And you can imagine that if you have a really great talented group of people that are a great mix and you feel you are silenced because it's not safe to speak up, then that would certainly reduce your joy in that particular space and it would reduce your contribution. While if you're in another group that does have this ability where I can speak up and I can even challenge the authority, where the authority in the room allows for questioning because no one has the answer that anyone that the collective might be able to find, that actually makes a really big difference. So think of psychological safety as the safety to speak up and to say your mind, and when it's at its highest level, even with the authority, with respect, you're able to question and have that open dialogue. So if you want to create that kind of environment, which allows for that to occur, it needs to actually start on the first day. The research really strongly supports the notion that at the orientation of all new members, there's a message of this is the way we want to work here. It's almost a cultural statement about what's really required. But it also requires the leader to have the humility to the servant leadership, the humility to be able to recognize that they don't necessarily know all the answers. And the simple tip that I encourage leaders to think about is speak in questions rather than in answers. If you ask it as a question, if you actually pose it and say, instead of think we should do this, then the notion becomes, let me ask the group, what do you think? And I heard this wonderful line from a terrific leader many years ago who said, as a kind of a principle in his mind, was never say things that people already know, which is an interesting proposition, which also means that You have to know what people know.
Right.
And therefore, you've got to ask the question first. What do you know? What do you think about this situation? What do you think the problem is, even before the answer? And then we'll be able to engage in a conversation about what can we do about it. And then once I know what you know, I'll add value to it. So you are always in the added value space rather than speaking first. So 3 tips. Number 1, do it in the onboarding. Number 2, get good at asking questions. And number 3, speak after you hear the voices of your people. Let them speak first. And you'll see that that will allow people to feel more comfortable bringing forward their thoughts into the collective.
I want to connect the dots between psychological safety and innovation, particularly knowing that you wrote the book called
Right?
Creative Intelligence. And
Yes.
the point you raised earlier is that when you have that psychological safety, people will actually be open to challenge the status quo. And that is one of the key foundations that fuels innovation. Because if no one is challenging the status quo and asking why are we doing this and could we do it potentially better, companies actually fall in this complacency culture where we're not asking the right questions that actually fuel creative and innovative thinking. Could share with us some of the key insights from that specific book that you wrote on innovation and connecting the dots between joy and innovation.
So, 2 really big ideas that emerged from the book Innovative Intelligence, which I've been continuing to work on. That book went viral and it actually got translated in multiple languages. I was teaching in Shanghai because one of the languages was Chinese. So there was a tremendous amount of interest in that particular work. And I think it was because of 2 major propositions that I think relate to joy in the end. Number 1, the argument was that we're not going to take people over 30, 40, 50 years old and put them on a training course and make them more innovative. The proposition was I can make you a leader of innovation, someone who can draw out the innovative capacities of individuals and teams, but I can't rewire your brain and just snap my fingers and teach you a trick and you'll become more innovative. It's not going to work, but I can have you work more effectively with people and with the collective with whatever level of innovative capacity you have to work with their innovative capacities and then together see if you can ultimately generate insight into what the issues are and ultimately what the problems are in that situation. So that was a very big idea that was transformational because a lot of the literature is about how do we make people more innovative rather than how do we make you be a leader who can draw out the innovative capacities. It calms people down, it relaxes them, it makes them feel less scared of innovation if I'm telling them that they don't have to change. Their cognitive capability doesn't have to change. What has to change is the way they work with people. The second big insight in innovative intelligence was a surprise to us. And that was that if you don't have a level of emotional intelligence, then what will occur is you won't create the climate where you could be an effective leader of innovation. And for years, I was working on what is a way to know that a leader has that emotional intelligence and what is that element? And that brings us back to psychological safety. Psychological safety as an outcome of those who tend to are creating that environment where they can allow people to talk up. And one of the significant impacts of this kind of environment that a leader who's a leader of innovation, who works with their emotional intelligence to make it psychologically safe, is that people feel empowered and they feel like they're meaningfully contributing and their voice is heard, which is a significant contributor to contentment, feeling empowered, and ultimately joy and happiness in the workplace. So we're finding an association with that kind of leadership and engagement scores where if when that occurs people feel more engaged, and more engaged means that they're giving their discretionary effort to situations because they care, because they find it important and they feel that they can make a meaningful contribution. So innovative intelligence as a thought, as a concept, doesn't mean you've got to be more innovative. It means that you have to have the innovative intelligence to draw it out of others in a way that really allows the others to have voice.
Since we're talking about meaning,
Mm.
what role does purpose play within an organization from your experience?
It's interesting. I've been using the word purpose a great deal in organizations. For a while, organizations would go vision, mission, values. That was the kind of language. I often found that the words vision and mission were confused. People said, well, what's a vision? What's a mission? But when you transform that and you work with the senior folks, which I do frequently, and trying to help them organize and think about what they really are there to do, the message becomes, yes, where do I want to be in 5, 10 years? That might be a statement of vision. But purpose is, who are we? Why do we exist? What's the real essence of our organization? And using the word purpose resonates just so much more as something very, very meaningful, even from an organizational perspective. But from an individual perspective, each individual finding their own purpose is something that is a significant challenge for many people, but it ultimately could bring a much greater centeredness and balance in their life. You know, if you think about people, I also work as an executive coach, and in that environment, sometimes I meet people where their life is their work, and that's what they have, and they're struggling at that particular time in their life, and the work is not fulfilling that purpose anymore, and they're left with a vacuous experience, which could be totally damaging to the individual. If you're able to find a purpose that is not just linear, it's not just in one place, protect yourself as an individual. Find purpose within work. Work is very important in life, but find purpose within your family. Find purpose within your own spiritual well-being and who you are as an individual. Find purpose in your friendships, your relationships, and expand the horizon and the depth of your purpose. A lot of people think, oh, it's one thing, one purpose, and that's it. I would suggest that you need to have multiple purposes because some of them might slip. Some of them might fall behind, and then you end up falling into this deep abyss, which could be very, very damaging for the individual. But those who have balance, and let's say their work situation changes and it's no longer that positive, they may have something that they can just reinforce them as they go through more difficult times. And that gives them some more resiliency, some ability to bounce back more effectively, and then ultimately to recover from the situation. The person who's really happy isn't someone who's the comedian who's telling jokes all the time. The person who's really happy is the one who's really content with who they are. And by having that kind of purpose in multiple places, I believe that the individual will have a better chance to stay that way.
I fully agree with the multi layers of purposes, particularly in the world that we live in, whereby, as you're saying, if certain individuals truly are making work their life and connect so deeply and only to the purpose of the organization in a context of economic turmoil or
Absolutely.
downsides where we see organizations laying off employees, what happens to those employees that only had a purpose that was connected deeply to the organization? All of a sudden, it's almost like you lose your reason for being. It's just so essential what you have shared to truly encourage our listeners to explore all those facets of purpose, because it is absolutely essential to finding more joy and fulfillment in life. So thank you.
But work is not the only vulnerable place. I mean, the other personal lives might be vulnerable. Your relationship with your partner, could be vulnerable at various points. And ultimately, if you are only in one place, then you will be at risk. Might be really great, but if something happens where it changes, it could affect you. So, for example, when I do coaching, a lot of people when they work with executives or senior leaders in organizations, and now obviously with technology that we're using, the reach is global. So it is really no limit on the reach that we can have. So cross culturally, it's so fascinating, it's so interesting. But what ends up happening is, you find that individuals are able to, share not just who they are from a work context. Certainly you're being brought in and paid by the organization, even though the organization doesn't get any feedback, it's confidential. So it's totally with the individual that you're coaching, but they see it as a worthwhile investment. But the message is that you have to deal with the whole person. You don't coach only on work. I think that's inconsistent with best practices. I think the right answer for a coach, for a leader who's actually coaching for someone in my capacity would be an external during the coaching, would be that you ultimately should be thinking of the person holistically. And it's relevant what are their supports outside of work. It's relevant how they are dealing with their own family. it's relevant also how they are dealing at work with people, with cross-functionally, with the various elements. All of it is material, and it's not focus only on one, even though you're brought in an organizational context. I think we have to think holistically. One of my earlier books, The Leadership Gap, which was written before Innovative Intelligence, the principle was we needed holistic leaders. The notion there was we need to get away from, oh, I'm going to send you on a course to learn how to be a team builder, and that's different than I'm going to send you on a course on how to be a strategist. They're all the same thing. It's all part of one. We have to make sure that people are seeing all of this as one systemic offering and one request of you as a holistic individual with the people that you're working with. And that principle was carried over in innovative intelligence, where we needed to do that as well. More recent book, Leadership Driven HR, was the notion of how does HR work with leaders to build that capacity so that the leaders are capable of actually working in this way, so that they're really becoming holistic leaders that could draw out those innovative capacities of individuals and teams.
As we're talking about organizations and their cultural context, we also have the reality that many organizations today have actually multiple generations. What can leaders do to embrace this reality and truly create groups that are focused on collaboration? I know we touched deeply on the psychological safety piece, but are there other specific actions or suggestions that you may have to help leaders that may find it difficult to deal with different generations because of their different needs and life realities?
I would start with the self awareness of the individual who is saying they need to deal with this and their own assumptions and biases that they may have in relationship to people who are of different ages. So we might have a younger individual who is now a leader of people who are 20, 30 years older than them. That's possible. And, it always was a reverse where there were older people who were leaders of people who were younger. So cross-generational groups existed for a long time. This is not a new advent, but people live longer. People don't want to retire and they're capable of working. And why should they not continue? What is the notion of at a certain age you have to leave? It's certainly an empowerment of those who are able to continue to work as long as they are able. But what I would first ask people to do is to look into themselves and become self-aware. Do they have certain preconceived assumptions about people who are of a certain age other than their own, or even of their own? And does that assumptions that they have create a context where they make some behavioral responses to it with their self-creating it? So take some ownership of this. This is a systemic issue. It's not just one way where I'm okay and gee, they're older, I've got to deal with someone who's a different generation. The second element is what would happen if your opening offer would be to disregard age and treat it as a irrelevant variable, just like we should treat gender as an irrelevant variable, or we should treat country of origin as an irrelevant variable, or we should treat the language that's your first language as an irrelevant variable. So you may be speaking English as a second language or even third language. And what if we said, my opening move is I'm going to relate to you as a human being and address you in the way that I would address any individual with the absolute respect for your humanity, rather than attempting to put you into some sort of category, some assumption, which invariably is incorrect. When we're dealing with these things about, oh, people of a certain age have certain patterns, these people went through this life experience, and therefore they are like that. All we're talking about from a statistical perspective is a normal curve where most people are like each other, but there are going to be some more extremes based upon that kind of analysis. What if we went in with the assumption that most people are human beings and stop this internal rhetoric, the desire to categorize individual, instead of that element, which is ultimately going to distort your perception of people and have you walk into the room in a way that actually may not optimize what you really need to do. So, and then you may be faced with generational differences. It might occur. Even after all that, it might occur and there might be elements. But I'd ask you, what's your default? What's your opening play? Is your opening play, oh, I've got 3 generations in my group, I better worry about that? Or is my opening move, who are these individuals as human beings? Let me respect you for who you are. And that way, and then see how it plays out if you need to adjust according to the situation that you have. In most cases, you'll find people want to be honored. I tell people when they implement change, I wrote a recent piece that was really quite wonderful. It went viral. It got picked up by about 4 or 5 different locations. It was called "Winning Against Resistance to Change," and one of the pieces in that, which was quite pivotal, was this notion of when you actually are dealing with change, you have to honor the past. Don't go in when you're implementing change thinking what you're doing is wrong and I know how to do it right. You'll just alienate people. Instead, when you implement change, go in there and think about what is the best fit of a solution to the context that we're facing. At one point, the context was quite different, pre-COVID, pre-technological advances, and so on. And therefore, the way we worked fit that environment in that context, but it no longer fits the new context. So I want to honor the past. Thank you for doing what you did. It's not like the older folks or whatever, you did good work. It was what we had given that context. Now we need to discover a better fit to the new reality. So that would be my proposition. The two things is look at your self-awareness of it and ultimately be aware of what prejudices and biases and ultimately assumptions you may have and deal with that possibility or address it, at least check yourself. And then the second thing is go in there thinking that these are human beings, remove the artifact of age, just like you'd remove the artifact of eye color, and ultimately allow yourself to engage people as individuals. And then if you do get some artifacts that do appear, deal with them as they arise, rather than going in there with that assumption.
Several global studies are indicating that there's a very low engagement level that we have across organizations. So, if a leader listening today has that situation within their existing team whereby the employees have given very low scores in terms of their overall motivation and engagement within that specific organization and culture, what actions would you recommend for that leader to take?
What a leader can do in a localized environment with the people that they are entrusted to lead, or as a leader of a project team, what they can do doesn't necessarily have to mirror what the entire organization does. In the organization, if you're in the middle of an organization, you're probably not going to have the ability to influence and create the environment that will allow for the entire organization's engagement scores to change, the joy at work to change. But as a leader, you have an accountability to create an environment with the people that you are collaborating with and that you are leading so that you change the dynamic there. So I would focus small, unless you're the one who's running the organization. Then you have a systemic challenge, you have an enterprise level challenge. Many listeners are people who have a responsibility within their own space. The joke is every time you point a finger at someone else, you have 3 fingers pointing at yourself. So the notion of how do you actually take ownership of what you can do, your own contribution in your own space? Where do you have the ability to influence and where do you not? If you can't control it in the entire organization, then at least make it a safe space for those people that report to you. And that's where I would start. So start small, start local, start where you have the ability to have some meaningful influence rather than blaming the organization for what you might end up feeling is happening to the people you report to. Now, that all sounds too simple because, someone might say, yes, but you don't have my boss, who's pressuring me and that gets filtered down and I can't break the pattern, the energy. It's taking out all the energy from the organization. I don't want to oversimplify it, but whatever you can do in the area that you could protect and you can help, that would be a gift. And sometimes the greatest joy is giving rather than receiving. And if you could help people have a meaningful contribution at work, even if you're the one that's the umbrella that's protecting them on an ongoing basis and you have to struggle, then at least you'll get the joy of feeling that you have helped others fulfill their potential, even if the overall environment is very challenging. You know, if you are the enterprise leader, though, or a leader of a larger mandate, then it is your accountability to start focusing intensely on what is this culture that you have. And the way I look at culture is what people do and say when no one is looking. Culture is the patterns of behavior that ultimately have assumptions under it, that if we speak up, we're going to get into trouble. So I'm not even going to speak up. If I actually apply for a job, they're going to think that I'm not loyal. So there are assumptions that occur, and we need to, I call it the laser beam approach in culture change. Find the two or three things that you're doing now, the assumptions you're doing now that you want to reinforce, and that'll build more trust. You're not going to change everything. And find the two or three things in the culture that are the assumptions that you need to challenge and you need to reverse. Don't go for everything. Go for your 80-20 rule. What's that 20% that'll give me 80% value? And if we modify that, if we flip it, then ultimately we might be able to make a significant change. You have a major accountability. If that exists, you can't say it's someone else anymore. If you're the leader of the enterprise, you own it. And it's your responsibility to bring the joy back into work.
What role do you believe AI will play within organization, in the leadership context? And how can our listeners get ready for that future?
I mean, even if you take something like the calculator and you think about the anxiety that was created for people who were counters when the calculator came out, that people won't know math anymore, they'll just use a calculator. And what ends up happening, at least historically, over many advances, same thing with the computer, same thing with the web, same thing with social media, what tends to happen is it commoditizes the technology contribution that is ultimately introduced. So using the simple example like the calculator, adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing and doing basic processes like that became less of a expertise, but it generated associated expertise that needed around it to be able to leverage it in the most effective way. And that expanded and created new work and new jobs. When computers came out, people said, oh, everybody, there won't be any jobs left for anybody because we have computers now. And the same thing occurred. It generated a whole host of other elements that were related to it. When the web came out, people said, oh, all this information that's available. And then ultimately it generated a whole host of other complex work. If you look at the list of the top 100 jobs, usually at around 50% of them are different than 5 years ago. It's that fast how the technologies are commoditizing certain kind of work and evolving the nature of work around it to create new kinds of work that's happening. If AI operates in the same manner, it will help a great deal in a lot of different ways. So, people are, getting better at writing emails because they go to AI and say, I have to tell someone I didn't like that project. And AI writes it for them in 4 sentences and gives them a nice, healthy way of saying it rather than saying it in an ineffective way. So they get the message across and then they send that as an email. It's saving a lot of time. Quick reports are effective as well. I think we'll have to see if, in fact, if it could totally replace the capability of an executive to make strategic decisions and to have the emotional intelligence to know how to lead an organization, to know how to work with key stakeholders. My immediate inclination is it will become an asset to the executives that will allow them to more rapidly make certain choices. I would be surprised if it allows them to be totally replaced by the AI. And the reason why is the following. And if you distinguish problems from what is complex versus what is complicated, something that is complicated has a knowledge base, a research base that ultimately we would use to ultimately be able to know what to do. And I think that we could build programs that will give us the proper technological answer about whether you should get a raise or not based upon the math and based upon what is happening elsewhere and standards in the system. But when you deal with complexity, We're dealing in situations where the level of agreement about what you should do is unknown. Everyone disagrees. It's climate change. No one agrees on that. And the level of certainty is unknown. And what you need is you need a different kind of insight. So I think that the possibility of AI to have an impact on surgery is probably greater than the possibility of AI impacting a childcare worker, because surgery is much more an expertise, a technical expertise, very sophisticated, very talented people, but yet we might be able to get robotics, we might to get different things that can replace a good deal of that. Working with a child, the ultimate complex entity, will not be able to get that kind of experience. And I suspect that we'll find more and more the value contribution will be on the complex contribution, dealing with those situations more than on the technical, which might be able to be replaced more and more by this kind of technological advancement. But running an organization requires, if it's not complex, why is the executive not dealing with it? Why is an executive in your situation dealing with a raise? That's not their job. That's not the expectation of them. That should be dealt with by other people in that organization. It should be dealt with purpose. It should be dealt with, how do we create a climate in our organization? How do we create an understanding in our community of people who actually use our services, what we're all about and who we are? That's something that I haven't seen yet, something like an AI actually even touching.
Indeed, we'll see what the future holds for all of
We'll
us.
see what that movie comes next. Certainly, people get nervous about AI. I'm not nervous about it. I think it has utility. I think it will be an asset. It's going to accelerate things.
As you look on back on your career and that has had such a richness to it, what are some of the key life lessons that you have learned when it comes to living a fulfilling life?
I've seen experts who say, I want to do one thing, and they could be successful for a period of time with one thing. And there's been a lot of people who said, focus, focus, focus on one thing, and that's all it is. I haven't found that to be a sustainable model. And what I find is build multiple areas of expertise over time, build multiple areas of purpose, as I talked about before, build ways that you're able to have something that goes with the good times and something that goes with the bad times, because this wheel of life will continue to go around. Things won't remain good all the time, and they won't remain bad all the time. And can you be thinking a little bit longer range to have this? It's not even a balance, it's multifactored. It's a multifaceted life. Go out for a walk, enjoy life, breathe the air, celebrate. The world is in chaos at this present time. We see so much going on in the world. How do you, even in that context, find a moment where you can replenish yourself? And that will show up at work, where at work you'll come in as a whole person rather than coming in as an empty person. So one thing I've found is in multiple ways, it's important to have multiple facets. Your family, your children, if you do have any, your friends, your own spirituality, your own creative efforts. What are you doing with your own creativity? Myself, I've always been a singer all my life, and I used to sing in a very fancy, sophisticated choral group, which was a lot of fun. And then they started taking attendance and I couldn't make it all the time. So I joined in Toronto, where I currently live, a large group rock choir. So four-part harmonies, singing Pink Floyd and Queen, and for 2 hours every week at a rehearsal. That's all I did. And the world was whatever it was, and my work was whatever it was, and even my family was whatever it was. But for those 2 hours, that's what I was focused on. How do you actually create other ways to express yourself so that you could feel that you're multifaceted and not just locked into one thing and relying on one thing as your source of joy? That perhaps would be something that I've done that's been useful for me.
This brings me to my last question. If there would be a recipe to elevate our own joy, what would be the three main ingredients?
At some point, whatever you're doing at work is likely to stop. So, uh, again, what might you have that is ready for you so that you have a meaningful and purposeful ability to do something that you really enjoy, that you really care about. At that point, it's very challenging for people who are ending the work life and they feel totally empty. So one is, build that multifaceted piece that I mentioned before. The second thing, I would come to the work environment, and you as a leader need to own leadership and what you do with the people who are those that are entrusted to you as direct reports, or who are entrusted to you if you're leading a project. And take accountability and not think about what others are doing that are getting in the way of you being able to build the kind of climate that you really want to create. You can do and stop the bad patterns of an organization, and it could stop with you. And are you able to take ownership of that to the best of your ability to ultimately allow the environment that you are able to have influence over to be a safer environment, which brings us back to psychological safety and so on. And then the last piece is, how do you actually create an environment where people can thrive? That it's not just protection, but it's actually fulfilling potential. And in my mind, one of the things in my life that's been very important to me is that I'm always struggling and trying to find where is my ability to advance my own potential. It never stops, no matter what age I'm at. It'll be to the last day of my life where I'll be spending time thinking about what I can do to fulfill my potential. It's a lifelong journey, and there's just so much more that can be done. It's not accomplishments, it's not degrees, it's not writing another book. It's fulfilling the essence of who you are. And by virtue of doing that, the chances are you'll feel like you have purpose, you have a life that's meaningful. And as a leader, you have the capability of enabling others to strive to do that as well. So if you see certain people as favorites and you have assumptions about other people, all that is getting in the way of you being someone who's going to be that admired leader. The research out of the American Institute on Leadership, the Corporate Leadership Council, was the number one non-monetary motivator for employees is working for an admired leader. I'd like every leader to think of themselves as, how do I be a leader that can create the environment that lets people's potential really show, that I'm part of their legacy, and that ultimately I created that admired leadership role that will create that potential. I think there's a great opportunity here, and it's something that many people, if they just give it a little extra thought, will be able to take the next step, just whatever step you're at, just one step forward to see if actually you can make a difference.
David, thank you immensely for everything you have shared.
Thank you so much.